me and him are like telepathic, you know what I mean?
I know my brother better than anybody else.
When both come together, you have greatness.
The announcement that the British rock band Oasis is reuniting for a new tour 15 years after brothers Liam and Noel Gallagher's acrimonious split has caused a sensation in the UK. It's been the most talked about story for a week, with more than 1 million people scrambling for tickets to next year's gigs, and tickets are changing hands for as much as £10,000, over $13,000 on the resale market. Well, hits such as Wonderwall, Champagne Supernova and Don't Look Back in Anger will be performed at the UK's biggest arenas, with the tour then expected to go global. The announcement also reignited memories of one of the most explosive musical feuds in the industry's history, when the so-called Battle of Britpop divided the country between fans of Oasis and Blur in a race for superiority in the music charts. In the 30 years since, there have been plenty of musical feuds and fallouts, such as the tensions between hip-hop giants Drake and Kendrick Lamar, or Kanye West and Taylor Swift. But at that time, Blur versus Oasis became the biggest rock rivalry since the Beatles versus the Rolling Stones. And it's never really disappeared. A new stage play about the feud called The Battle is heading to London's West End next year. So who won the Battle of the Britpop bands? Let's revisit the debate with a pair of music experts to look back at the anger and abuse that divided the country by geography, class and culture. Well, I'm joined now by British broadcaster and music journalist Adrian Goldberg and John Robb, editor of the music publication Louder Than War, whose recent interview with Noel Gallagher gave fans new hope of a reunion between these strange brothers. So John, I'm going to start with you and just like to revisit that infamous feud between Oasis and Blur. But let's start with the news of Oasis, which has caused quite a sensation among music fans in the UK and around the world. Tell me how you got that exclusive interview with Noel.
Well, the interview I did with Noel was actually for the Definitely Maybe album. They were going to, it came out last week. It was a release of it. They had 2 attempts to record it initially, and the one you actually get to hear is a third attempt to record it. So Noel remixed the first 2 attempts. And Noel was going to do 1 interview for the album. He asked me to do the interview. So it was filmed for them, you know, for Noel's people, Oasis people, wherever it was at the time. This is done months ago, so there's no sign of the band reforming. Now when I think about it, I don't think they'd actually reformed at the point of time doing the interview. And what I was saying before the interview, you know, obviously they wanted me to talk about the album in the interview, but I didn't really want the Noel v Liam thing, because kind of knowing them over the years, I know that there is an intense rivalry. They haven't spoken genuinely in 15 years. But I think if that's the only story that becomes out of the whole Oasis thing, you're kind of missing out on a lot of the stuff. And I said, wouldn't it be nice if you actually talked about the positive side of it? And he did. He was very nice about Liam. So when the interview got shown a week ago, which now seems like a year ago, people go, oh, God, this is a very different Noel. He's bigging up Liam and he's bigging up the band. Is there something going on? And 48 hours later, something did go on.
So your chat may have had some sway in the whole thing.
Yeah, I like to think that. Yeah, it's me personally reformed the band. I mean, I think Noel's a very smart operator. So I think he would have known the right time to do this. You know, I think he picked exactly the right time to do this, didn't he? I mean, it's weird now we're in a position where the band actually seems bigger than they were in 1996. The smart tickets they're selling for these live shows, or whatever cost they are for tickets, is higher than when they did the Nebworths 30 years ago, which seems crazy.
Well, let me bring in Adrian. And Adrian, why is this such a big deal for music fans in the UK and around the world?
I think you've got the phenomenon of nostalgia, people who remember Oasis from the first time round in the 90s. And of course, because the band split up, those people haven't had the opportunity to see the band for many, many years. But also, I think the band's musical influence has filtered down to their children. And I know that Oasis memes are massive on TikTok at the moment. Somebody getting a Liam Gallagher haircut on TikTok, a British model, has had 2.4 million views. On Instagram, searches for Oasis style. And this is even before the reunion were quite a thing. So I think you've got the combination of nostalgia from parents who want to relive their youth, but also their children who got into the music. You know, clearly there's an enduring quality about the music of Oasis that their kids have bought into, and a very particular British fashion style as well.
Well, Adrian, there's also the fact that the parents would know about the feud between two of the most successful British bands in the 90s. There was, of course, that rivalry between Oasis and Blur. So how has that kind of come into the mix, Adrian?
Truthfully, these days, that's really gone. I think it was a very much of its moment in the mid-90s, very much beloved of the tabloids. You know, who doesn't love a band war? They were probably harking back to a time when John and I were scarcely born, to a Beatles versus Stones feud. So I think the people who ran the tabloids understood that there might be mileage, and clearly there was some degree of animosity between the bands. But ultimately now, I think all these years on, I think truthfully both bands stand in their own right. Both were significant bands of the 90s, and both still have a vital musical influence today. So I don't think, truthfully, that feud is selling tickets in 2024.
Well, I was going to ask John then, how, you know them, you've been close to these guys. How is the difference between the two bands, or how did that difference fuel the rivalry, and how did the fans embrace it at that time?
I think it's quite interesting because I think something outside the UK would be quite difficult to understand, but it was all about class, geographies, north, east, south, working class versus perceived middle class. Oasis kind of initially thought Blur were trying to jump on their bandwagon, and Blur probably thought Oasis trying to jump on their bandwagon. I mean, Noel Gallagher, when I interviewed about 20 years ago, he said that the music media and the music business had the stage set for Britpop, and Blur were going to be the main band in it. Then we turned up and they never forgave us. And I think even that part actually still gets played out to this day, because I think you see a lot of people in the UK music media not that comfortable with Oasis, even like 30 years later. But I think it was Blur's manager. He was a brilliant operator who actually worked in the same newspaper as me and Adrian did at the time, who actually sort of created the initial Blur v Oasis thing, but then he just ran away because, like Adrian was saying, it's a great story. Everyone likes a band rivalry, you know, Beatles, Stones, Clash, Pistols, you know, T-Rex, Bowie. Some are more serious than others, but it creates all these little sort of debates around it. You know, which side are you on? Are you? And it's all kind of showbiz in a way as well, and it's like a showbiz idea of the class system in the UK, and which still goes on, and I think all our culture is riven with those kind of divisions and those kind of ideas.
But John, you know, knowing your friendship with the Gallaghers, is it fair to say that Blur were a little more magnanimous, while the Gallagher brothers were merciless in their put-downs that ranged from like hilarious, typically British one-liners to actually some quite shocking comments?
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff said wasn't that great, was it? But I think both sides. I don't think there was much evidence of anybody being that magnanimous at the peak of it. I think they're both pressing each other's buttons. You know, I think obviously there was a fun side to it. It's great getting the tabloid headlines, but I think there's a serious side to it as well. But after a few years, it like Adrian was saying, it stopped. You know, Noel's made records with Damon, and then there's a mutual respect between most of them nowadays, isn't there?
And you know, Adrian, John was saying about how everyone loves a bit of rivalry between various stars and bands and so on. How much do you believe the rivalry was genuine? How much was actually blown up to the benefit of both bands?
Well, I think at the time it was genuine. As you say, there were some quite bitter comments going to and fro. And as John suggests, it started off maybe as one of those little bits of hype that the music papers, of which John and I were part, were happy to seize on. But then it became a whole tabloid rivalry, and every comment was seized on, every comment was blown up. So I think there was a real thing behind it. But I really do think that was then and this is now. And I don't think it's particularly germane to the music buying public in 2024. And you also have to look, you know, if you're thinking about Oasis, this is a band who went worldwide. They had 3 platinum selling albums in the United States. They had MTV Europe Awards. I think they won 4 MTV Europe Awards. So this was something that played out in the UK press, but I don't think Oasis would have had that global success. I think they would have had that in any event. I don't think they would have had it if they didn't have great songs that were able to endure. I just kind of think that moment's gone, you know.
All right. Well, I was going to say, though, just for those who weren't born at that time, John, perhaps things came to a head during the race for #1 in 1995 to get that top single. Tell me about that and the effect it had on the country at the time.
Well, I think that was the peak of it, really, one of the great Britpop wars. You know, I think it's Alan McGee that said that when we lost the battle, but we actually won the war, because the Oasis album came out. They didn't get the #1 single, but their album comes out and it's one of the best-selling albums ever in the UK. I think it's in the end, if you look at the Beatles Stones thing, I always think this about that. You know, the Stones were the biggest band in the 60s, but the Beatles the biggest phenomenon in the 60s. You know, you can only get to a certain level as a band. You're not going to get any bigger. But some bands go beyond that into the stratosphere. And I think in the UK especially, that's what Oasis did. They became a band that everybody had an opinion on, and Blur were just a really big band. And that was kind of the result of what came out of the Britpop wars.
Yeah, you described what happened there, but let me ask you, John, starting with you and maybe get Adrian's perspective afterwards. Numbers apart, I mean, maybe an unfair question, but who do you think made the better music and which has stood the test of time?
I think they're both really good. I think they both do really different functions. I mean, Blur are fantastically inventive, but then of course Damon Albarn is a brilliant magpie as well. I don't think anybody's, you know, people always have this idea that Oasis, everything they stole was off the Beatles, but knowing Noel Gallagher, well, I know he likes a lot of music way beyond the Beatles. He doesn't just have the Beatles red and blue records, you know, he's really into post-punk, he's really into obscure underground bands, you know, there's a lot of stuff in that melting pot. There's a few nicks in there, but every band nicks bits of stuff off other people anyway. And so I think there was with Blur, there was a kind of an artful inventiveness to their music, but it takes an equal amount of skill to write a song that 80,000 people in the field can completely connect with. And it's those kind of everyman songs are difficult to write. Otherwise, there'd be hundreds and hundreds of bands doing them. I think there's equal but very different talents at play here.
Well, Adrian, what's your take on that, and which has stood the
Well,
test
no,
of
listen,
time?
I'm sad to agree with John, really. I think if you, from a kind of the traditional music critic's point of view, I think Blur are probably seen as the more artistic band, seen as the more creative. I think Damon Albarn is the individual of all of the people involved in this particular discussion who has kind of continued to push at boundaries musically. But if I go for an evening out in the pubs and clubs of the West Midlands, which is home to neither Oasis or Blur, and they might have a guitarist there, a singer-songwriter just entertaining people in the pub, what will we hear? We won't hear a Blur song. We will hear, in all probability, Wonderwall or another song by Oasis. And they have got the brilliant ability to write songs that connect with people and connect with people over the decades, and that is not something to be in any way sneered at or dismissed. That's a great talent.
Well, John, you'd indicated that Noel and Blur's Damon Albarn have long since buried the hatchet, and they've even collaborated musically. Now, is it possibly the bigger feud was between the Gallagher brothers in Oasis, Liam and Noel, or do you think that their relationship has been truly repaired? Or perhaps the prospect of a multi-million-dollar payday simply papered over the cracks? What do you think, John?
Well, I think there's probably both factors at play, but I think the thing is, if it's your brother and you're falling out there, you're still joined together somehow, aren't you? So at some point you're gonna have to sort this situation out. I think, you know, there's a genuine emotional thing there. You want to sort it out, don't you? So maybe that's what happened. Maybe they haven't. Maybe, you know what? There's always this mistake that bands make, you know, especially younger bands. It's your gang against the world. But when you're an older band, maybe you don't get on. But when you're on stage, it's so magical. It sounds so brilliant. There's a certain chemistry that you could put, not getting on those people. I mean, the Rolling Stones worked out a way of operating despite 10 years and not that Jagger and Rich not getting on. In the end, they have got on, haven't they? They've actually worked, it's got to the other side of that situation. So all that's in there. I think, of course, the money is a prime factor or a big factor in reforming, but there's still a thing that when you're on stage or in a rehearsal room, when you're both there together, there's something truly magical happens. You know, that chemistry that people talk about. I think it's worth putting up with all the other stuff to get to that situation.
Well, with the world we live in today, streaming has created a totally different environment for bands. And here's one for both of you, maybe starting with you, Adrian. Today on Spotify, Blur has 11 million monthly listeners, and their most popular song, Song 2, is closing in on 1 billion streams, while Oasis has more than 28 million monthly listeners, and their song Wonderwall has racked up an incredible 2 billion streams. So with both bands back on stage performing again, do you expect that that new generation will discover them and they'll continue performing, even though it was the parents' music for these youngsters and they know nothing about the past feuds, perhaps?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the great things about streaming services and video services like YouTube is that although sadly artists perhaps don't get their fair reward from them, the upside is that young people can access music from previous generations in a way that John and I would have found really difficult when we were young music critics starting out. So my kids can, at the push of a button, listen to Oasis and listen to Blur and listen to a whole range of other bands. I was at a concert last night watching a fantastic Scottish band called Bell and Sebastian, who've been knocking around for 27 years. But my kids, who are considerably younger than me, of course, were into them. And I think this kind of division and this tribalism around music, I wouldn't say it's disappeared altogether, but I think it is a very different music culture now, where you can just say to somebody, have a listen to that. And whether it was recorded in 1960, 70, 80, 90, or last week, it's just there at the push of a button. So I think young people will continue to discover Blur. They'll continue to discover Oasis. That's brilliant.
John, Rob, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's true. I think all music is now contemporary. There's no sense of it being from what, like I remember, like the Beatles, when I was growing up punk, the Beatles seemed like they're from the Victorian times, whereas that now it's all level playing field, it's all there at once. I think Oasis have resonated through the generations. I mean, even when they do the solo gigs, if you go to Liam Gallagher solo gig, most of the crowd are about 16 years old. And I think also that's partially to do with his Twitter presence, because I think in a way he's like Britain's oldest teenager. You know, he talks like a teenager, which actually is not a critique, really. It's quite a cool thing to do, isn't it? He's funny and he has no filter. And then 16, 17-year-olds complete, you know, like he's standing there and, you know, people put something up, he puts a funny comment underneath, you know. So I think people like that as well, they fit into the modern age. Yes, on certain levels, there is a retrospective thing about them, but on another weird level, they feel very contemporary as well.
I can tell you one of the great satisfactions I have with my 18-year-old daughter is that if a song comes up on the radio and it's a remake, I can turn around and say, I heard the original when it first came out. John, Rob, Adrian Goldberg, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Cheers.
All the best.